Clive Davis wasn't just a music executive, he was the gatekeeper, a man who decided which voices got heard and which ones were silenced. If you wanted to rise in the industry, you played by his rules or you didn't play at all. But then came Barry White, a man with a voice that could melt stone, a presence so commanding it threatened the very order Clive Davis built his empire on. Barry didn't come in asking for permission. He wasn't interested in labels, control, or becoming someone's puppet. He made his own sound, built his own orchestra, and carved his own lane without kissing the ring. That's what made him dangerous. Behind closed doors, executives whispered about Barry. Not about his music, but about his refusal to bow down. Some say he was too independent. Others say he knew too much. He didn't just disrupt the system, he exposed its flaws. And while many played the game to survive, Barry made it clear he had no intention of selling his soul, not even for a Grammy. But the industry doesn't take kindly to men who can't be controlled, especially when those men are rising fast, owning their masters and inspiring others to do the same. So what did Barry know? And why did his name suddenly stop ringing out as loud as it once did? Barry White wasn't just a singer, he was a maestro, a producer, a businessman. He wasn't content with just laying vocals on a track. He wanted to own it. From day one, Barry made it clear. He would not be a pawn in someone else's game. While other artists signed away their rights for a shot at the spotlight, Barry was reading contracts, asking questions, demanding transparency. He understood the money trail, the publishing splits, the dark corners of royalty agreements that swallowed entire careers whole. And that's where the friction began. Barry knew the system was rigged, and worse, he wasn't afraid to talk about it. He spoke openly about how record labels manipulated charts, shelved albums to kill careers, and kept artists in perpetual debt despite platinum sales.
Greed is a funny thing. Once you take a bite of it, it tends to turn on you and start eating you up. The industry was making enough money. The industry was growing fast enough. The industry was progressing enough.
He even hinted at bigger games, whispers of payola, ghost ownerships, and backroom deals where the real power traded in influence, not talent. Clive Davis was at the center of that web, and Barry White. He was the one spider who refused to be caught. Insiders say Barry had files, paper trails, proof of artists being blackballed, of label executives siphoning off millions under dummy corporations. He allegedly confronted label heads about shady accounting practices and warned up-and-coming artists not to sign anything without a lawyer, something almost unheard of at the time. But the deeper Barry dug, the more enemies he made. Suddenly, collaborations were delayed, radio play dropped off, and awards season passed him by. It was subtle at first, a missing invitation here, a canceled appearance there. But Barry felt it. The chill. The industry closing its doors, not because he lost his talent, but because he refused to sell out. And in the background, Clive Davis, smiling for the cameras, pulling strings in the shadows. Whatever Barry White had uncovered, it scared people. Powerful people. The kind who don't like their secrets getting out. At the height of his fame in the mid to late 70s, Barry White was unstoppable, selling out arenas, topping charts, and becoming the deep voice soundtrack of romance around the world. But then something changed. Not overnight, but gradually, almost too perfectly. His new singles stopped getting major radio rotation. Promoters stopped calling. Albums that should have been automatic hits were barely marketed. Fans still adored him, but the machine behind him, the radio stations, the TV appearances, the award circuits began to stall. To the casual observer, it looked like Barry was just past his prime. But those close to him knew better. Behind the scenes, Barry was growing more vocal. He had started challenging record executives, especially Clive Davis, about discrepancies in royalties and contract clauses that seemed to disproportionately benefit the label. He questioned how other artists, less talented, less popular, were getting massive promotional budgets while his projects were being treated like afterthoughts. He even began talking publicly about forming his own label, one where artists would keep creative control and ownership of their masters. That's when the walls really started closing in.
Background, I guess. When I turned 17, I looked around me, and everywhere I looked, it was depression, people who were just going around in circles. I just felt that it was a better way of life. I had to make a change or go down.
In 1983, Barry released Dedicated, an album that critics now say was some of his best work, but it barely made a dent commercially. Why? Because it was buried. No push, no press, no singles getting airplay, not even the usual interviews or late-night performances. It was as if someone hit the mute button on Barry White's career. And that wasn't the only time. Throughout the late 80s, Barry tried to reinvent himself, even as he faced label rejections, budget cuts, and sudden contract terminations. Every move he made seemed to be met with resistance. TV networks claimed he was no longer relevant. Radio stations quietly removed him from their rotation. Industry friends became distant. Collaborations dried up. The same industry that once hailed him as a legend now acted like he didn't exist. To some, it looked like a fall from grace. But to those paying attention, it felt more like an erasure, a punishment. Barry hadn't just challenged a record label, he had challenged a system. And in doing so, he stepped on the wrong toes. Powerful ones. He was never officially blacklisted. No one ever said it out loud, but Barry knew. You don't need a signed memo when the phone stops ringing and your name disappears from the conversation. By the late 90s, Barry White had faded from the spotlight, but he was far from silent. In interviews, you could hear it, something deeper than the usual frustrations of an aging artist. There was pain, yes, but also a strange calm, like a man who had made peace with the fact that telling the truth had cost him everything. In a rare 1999 interview, Barry said something that didn't make headlines at the time, but now it reads like a cryptic warning. He said, "The industry is cold. Not just business cold, cold in the way it turns on you when you stop being useful to it." He didn't name names, he never did, but he didn't have to. Friends recall that Barry had grown paranoid in his final years. He believed phones were tapped, that conversations about launching an independent artist movement were being monitored, that people he once trusted were now middlemen feeding back information to higher-ups. One close confidant even claimed Barry once said, "If something happens to me, don't believe it was just health. I've been fine one day and sick the next too many times."
With record companies, when I say people, I'm talking about executives, and so many companies are folding because of taping. How do you survive, a black man with a black company?
I am not excluded from that nightmare of piracy and bootlegging. I look at it like this, Jay. When man becomes disenchanted with just making a living, when he turns to greed, it kills him every time.
Of course, by that time, his health was in decline. Years of stress, constant battles with labels, and the emotional weight of betrayal had taken their toll. Barry had kidney issues, high blood pressure, and eventually suffered multiple strokes. But, again, those close to him insist there was something unnatural about how fast it all unraveled, almost like it was triggered. In 2002, months before his death, Barry tried to mount a comeback, not to recapture fame, but to clear the air. He reportedly began working on a tell-all autobiography, something that would have named names, exposed contracts, and laid bare the price of going against the music machine. But the book never saw daylight. The notes, missing, the files, lost. Some even believe they were destroyed after his passing. In July 2003, Barry White passed away at just 58 years old. Official cause, kidney failure. But to many fans and those who followed his story closely, it felt like something more. Like the final chapter of a silenced legend. A voice too powerful, too honest, and too dangerous for the system he dared to confront. He never got to tell his version of the story, or maybe he did, just not the way anyone expected. When Barry White passed in July 2003, tributes poured in from fans, radio hosts, and R&B lovers around the world. His deep voice, romantic ballads, and velvet persona were celebrated everywhere. But within the music industry itself, the same one that once paraded him on magazine covers and sold millions of his records, the response felt muted. Strangely muted. There was no massive memorial concert, no all-star tribute, no re-release of his legendary albums to honor his legacy. For someone who shaped the sound of love for an entire generation, the silence was deafening. And the few artists who did speak up, they kept it generic. He was a legend, he'll be missed, rest in peace, but never touched on the years of conflict or the war Barry fought behind the scenes. Industry insiders claim it was just timing, that the world had moved on. But fans weren't convinced. To many, it felt like a deliberate hush, like there was a collective agreement to let Barry fade away quietly. The man who once roared through airwaves with unmatched soul was now treated like a closed chapter. But why? Some say it was fear. Barry had started to push boundaries the industry didn't want moved. Ownership rights, independent distribution, and exposing pay-to-play politics that still haunt the charts today. Honoring him fully would have meant acknowledging those battles, and maybe even the people he fought against. Others believe it was guilt, that the same machine that once praised his genius had chewed him up, silenced his voice, and now didn't know how to honor a man it had betrayed. So instead, it said nothing. Just platitudes, just silence. And maybe that's the most powerful statement of all. Because when a man like Barry White, who gave his life, soul, and truth to music, dies and the world barely flinches, you have to ask, was it just indifference? Or was it fear of what might resurface if his story were fully told? One thing's for sure. Barry may be gone, but the questions he raised, the secrets he took with him, and the silence that followed his death still echo loudly. And somewhere in that silence, you can almost hear his voice, still warning us, still defying them, still telling the truth, just not in the way they expected. They tried to bury Barry White beneath radio silence and forgotten accolades. But real legends don't stay buried. Over the years, something unexpected happened. Fans began connecting the dots, asking questions the industry refused to answer. Documentaries, deep dive podcasts, and fan-made tributes started painting a fuller picture of Barry White. Not just the singer of love songs, but the man who challenged the system and paid the price. A new generation discovered his music, not through mainstream radio, but through TikToks, YouTube mashups, and crate-digging DJs, spinning his records in underground clubs. And when they listened closely, they didn't just hear romance, they heard rebellion. His lyrics, his presence, even the way he owned his space as a plus-sized black man in a skinny, whitewashed industry, it was all revolutionary. Today, artists from every corner of the music world cite Barry as an influence. Bruno Mars, Anderson .Paak, The Weeknd, and countless R&B revivalists borrow from his tone, his smoothness, and his fearless sensuality. But even now, most don't know the full story of the man behind the microphone. Not yet. And maybe that's where we come in. Because telling Barry's real story, his fight, his exile, his silent war, isn't just about setting the record straight. It's about reclaiming a legacy the industry tried to erase. It's about reminding the world that Barry White wasn't just a voice. He was a force. A force that stood up when it wasn't safe to. A force that chose truth over comfort. A force that still resonates, long after the final note faded. So maybe he didn't get his standing ovation back then, but he's getting it now. From the fans who never forgot, from the truth seekers who kept digging, and from every soul who hears that deep, thunderous voice and feels something shift. Barry White is no longer just a memory. He's a movement.